You're listening to episode 222 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Mushim, Ikeda, and Brenda Salgado join us to talk about encouraging and creating diversity in our Sanghas. Hi, everyone. Before we get started with today's podcast, I want to extend an invitation to those listeners in or near or visiting the Twin Cities of Minnesota. For quite some time, we've been imagining what it would be like to fill a gap and create a truly secular meditation community, one that does not focus on a particular tradition, but instead meets people where they are, finding that practice intersection of our shared human experience in this life. To that end, in partnership with First Unitarian Society, I've started a weekly mindfulness meditation drop-in every Thursday evening from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis, Minnesota. For more information, you can use the contact page on this SBA website. Hope to see you there as we experiment with these first seeds of a secular community for contemplative practice, learning, and friendship. Think about this for a minute. We in the United States live in a time when we have the first African American president. We still see racial divides, deep disparity between classes, and bigotry masquerading as religious freedom. But we also see that being exposed for the sham it is. We see opposition to that which divides us, and support for everyone, regardless of race, ideology, gender, sexual preference, or identification, finding our shared human rights. This is not an easy evolution, and there's a long way to go before we rest. But right here, right now, we have a choice to not simply invite the wonderful strength of diversity in our Sanghas, but to create it in partnership with one another. Mushim Ikeda is a Buddhist teacher, author, mentor, and community activist. She teaches meditation retreats for people of color, women, and social justice activists nationally. She is a core teacher at East Bay Meditation Center, where she lives in Oakland, California. Brenda Salgado is the director of East Bay Meditation Center and has over 13 years of experience in nonprofit leadership and management, facilitation, strategy, and consulting. She has worked in the areas of environmental health and justice, women's health, and health equity. Throughout her career, she has served organizations such as Movement Strategy Center, Breast Cancer Action, Literacy for Environmental Justice, and Kids for the Bay. So, sit back, relax, and have a Coke, because some people really do want to teach the world to sing. Our guests today are Mushim Ikeda. Mushim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Ted.
And Brenda Salgado. Brenda, welcome.
Thank you so much.
I'm so glad both of you are here. It's a rare treat that we get two people on a given podcast, and especially to talk about our topic today, which is something we haven't visited in a while on the podcast. But before we go into that, I'd like to have each of you tell us a little bit about your background.
So I'm the director here at East Bay Meditation Center. And in terms of my background in meditation, many years ago, I took an introduction to meditation course at Nyingma Institute in Berkeley. While I loved the course as a foundation, I did not feel a sense of community there. And not long thereafter, I found East Bay Meditation Center as a place to continue that education and mindfulness and also have a sense of community, which I found lacking in some of the other places I had been. Great teachings, not as much as a sense of community. And then also just going further back, I would say being raised in indigenous culture, contemplative practice in nature, though we would never call it contemplative or mindfulness, is just basic to how I was raised and was a natural thing for me from a very young age to practice what many would call meditation or mindfulness in nature settings, but it was just not called that. It's just a way of being.
And Mushim, how about you?
Well, thank you, Ted. I came to Buddhism specifically through the doorway of Zen Buddhism, and I did not understand until many years later there was a direct kind of pipeline that led me there when Robert Aitken Roshi, who was a close family friend, and he had been a teacher of high school literature and poetry. And he said, Zen is poetry. And I thought, oh, okay, now I get it, duh, because I have a Master of Fine Arts in poetry writing from the University of Iowa Graduate Writers Workshop. And my entire life had really been dedicated to the arts and to poetry and contemporary literature. I was on a path. I had already published. I was on a path to be able to teach writing and literature at the university level, which I loved. I loved to teach. I had already started teaching and publishing. And then I just hit this existential crisis when I was in my, late 20s. And after I finished graduate school, at that time, I started practicing meditation. I did not know what I was doing. I'd read a lot on Zen Buddhism, and every book I read said, reading will do you no good. You have to find a teacher, and you need to learn how to practice meditation. So I happened after that to find myself working in an office in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and there was a Korean Zen Buddhist temple that was just starting up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I had never even heard of Korean Zen, only Japanese Zen, but that's all there was, so I went. I became very close to that community, and in 1983, after only a year, I made the very life-changing decision to go into that temple as a monastic resident under a vow of poverty and to devote myself full-time to the Dharma or to the study, the practice, and serving the Sangha or community within that tradition. And that radical move, because we weren't allowed to come in with any personal possessions, or we had to give everything away, not necessarily to the group, but we had to enter completely without any possessions. So I did that in 1983, and that started me on a series of madcap adventures and a lot of very hard training in many ways, and a lot of fun too in helping to start that temple. And then beginning to travel, and I began to re-enter lay life in 1989 in the Bay Area with the birth of my only child, and whom I have raised as a Buddhist. So I just continued my practice as a mother after he was born, and then gradually began to become more active in the Buddhist community the older he got, and then re-entered the Dharma through the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, Socially Engaged Buddhism. And all of that eventually helped to lead me to East Bay Meditation Center.
Wonderful story. Thank you for sharing that. So what do each of you do at East Bay Meditation Center?
So I'm the director here, been the director for about a year. I'm the first official director on paper, though I'm very quick to point out, even when I say that there are many people who served on the founding board and on the board in very director-like roles on a volunteer basis before I came on. And as some of those founding board members stepped away, that's when the organization was in in the space to need to hire a director. So I'm always very honoring of the generations and those who come before us, and very indebted to those, particularly David Filkey, who played a very director-like role for many years here before I came. Now that I'm here, one of our board members, Renee Rivera, is fond of saying Brenda's two of her important roles here are as connective glue, so bringing pieces of the Sangha together that have been somewhat siloed or separate up until now, just as they've been growing and forming. So connective glue between different parts of the Sangha. And then the other piece, she said, is our master storyteller. I love to tell the story of EBMC and the beauty of how we came about and the collective leadership that made that possible, and to tell the story of where we're headed together too, which is informed by the community. So on paper, it may be more admin, HR, finance, fundraising, all these things, but I really do see my role as kind of helping to tell that story and helping to connect across the Sangha, helping to support the staff in whatever ways are needed, and just to contribute to the circle that is here, figuring out who we are. And then I think because I come from an indigenous background, indigenous ceremony, and I'm an indigenous healer and curandera, I think there's ways that a lot of the role I'm playing here, though it wasn't part of my job description when I came, is to do a lot of work around indigenous ritual and community healing and community building in circle work. So we just held a restorative circle last night. It's the first one we've officially kind of held for folks in the community that were struggling with something together. And this work will probably continue with building that muscle across the Sangha to hold community space when we have challenge, and also community circle space when we're celebrating as well, and to learn from one another. So I do think, some of my indigenous background is bringing in ways of building community that get us out of our individualistic meditative heads and think about how to be more interconnected.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing to point out, is that the circle doesn't always have to be in the context of something went off the rails, but it can also be for celebrations and good things that we want as a community to share together.
Yeah, and certainly in indigenous community, circle work is just part of the culture, and it's a muscle you build together. And so that's something I see, not just me, but many other people taking leadership and building that muscle here within the Sangha across all levels. And then also just because of where I come from, just a strong sense of bringing more earth-based practice, connection to the earth. Again, sometimes in mindfulness communities, we can get very trapped in our heads and forget about the fact that interconnectedness is both about between us as human beings, but it's also about our connection to the earth, to the elements, to the other creatures and beings that share this planet with us, the trees. All of that is about our interconnection. And so, a deep dharmic practice, deep mindfulness practice is about coming home to all those relationships and understanding our humility and our place amongst that greater connection.
I completely agree. And thank you for sharing that, because we don't often get to express what it means to be an embodied part of the overall cycle in nature and in life and on the planet. So thank you for that. And Mushim, how about you? What do you do at East Bay Meditation Center?
Well, thanks for asking that. I am a core teacher here at East Bay Meditation Center, and that's a term that might change or phase in or out. What it has meant up to now is that I have been on the board of East Bay Meditation Center. I was on the board of directors for, 6 or 7 years, starting when we opened our doors in downtown Oakland in January of 2007, and then stepping down in order to become a part-time staff member. So I didn't go anywhere. My role just changed, and I'm the community coordinator. So I'm a part-time staff member. We're all part-time, and I work primarily with volunteers. And I also work in communications quite a bit, since I have training as a writer, and I love to communicate. Working with volunteers was very much a part of the training that I was given in being a staff member and part of the residential community at the Zen Buddhist Temple of Ann Arbor. We always had Sangha members coming and helping out with everything from construction, because we were a construction site, to gardening, to cooking, to giving us haircuts. And it was considered that manual work was part of our Zen Buddhist practice and training. So working with volunteers, taking an interest in their lives, their families, what they're going through, and how they're expressing their Dharma practice and their spiritual growth through volunteering for the temple is something I'm passionate about. I just love it. And I'm a writer, so I love hearing people's stories. In terms of being a core teacher, I'm often tapped, since I do have been a Buddhist monastic and a Buddhist for so long, is I'm tapped to teach kind of basic Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, 5 precepts, and so on. I really enjoy doing that. And I also am the guiding teacher and founder of a year-long program here, Ted, called Practice in Transformative Action. The acronym for that is PITA, like pita bread. And we're now in our second cohort, and that is secular mindfulness training for social justice activists. And it's defined that way because it's been funded in part by a small grant, which stipulates that it is secular mindfulness and it is for change agents and people who are involved in transformative change.
Wonderful. Thank you. And perhaps I'll convince you to come back to the podcast to talk specifically about that program because I'd like to find out more.
I would be delighted.
And I would love to just jump in and toot Mushim's horn because I knew she wouldn't say this. I also see that her role also here is an elder and an advisor. There's many ways that some of our younger leaders in the Sangha and also, elders too, that we do as someone who was core to the vision and the founding of this place, that when challenges arise or when we're just thinking about the future of VBMC, I think that Mushim has played a very strong elder, mentor, advisor role to many people in the Sangha and continues to do so.
So speaking of stories, Brenda, you mentioned how much you enjoy telling the story of East Bay Meditation Center. Tell us a bit of that story, if you would.
So I'm indebted to many of the founders who spent time sitting down with me when I started here about a year ago so that I could dig deeper into that story. As Mushim kind of mentioned earlier, we were founded a long time ago. What's interesting to me is some of that early history that I did not know as a member beforehand. We were originally incorporated as the East Bay Dharma Center, and there were many people coming on and off the board thinking about what the East Bay Dharma Center might become. I think there was some conversation amongst the group early on about becoming a Dharma center in Berkeley that would have been similar to many meditation centers that are out there already. And there would have been no harm in that. It would have done good work. And then there was another subset of folks, I think, who had a very clear vision about a different kind of place. Like there's enough of those kinds of places out there, and those folks were really clearly aligned around this vision of Oakland-based urban Dharma, commitment to diversity, commitment to generosity economics, commitment to environmental sustainability, and a commitment to transparent democratic governance. Most of those folks at that time who were relying around that vision had a real deep connection to insight meditation or vipassana. So there was this, I think, healthy dialogue about whether we would be East Bay Dharma Center somewhere in Berkeley, very committed to insight vipassana, and probably would be similar to many centers, largely white, largely older, and this subset of folks, I think, who really had a vision for a different kind of place. Many of their experiences really had to do with being queer or people of color or people with a different ability who had found a home in the Buddhist teachings in the different places they got trained up. And while they found liberation in the teachings and found that home that they were deeply grateful for, they were also surprised to find that racism, sexism, or different forms of oppression occurred in those communities that were largely older and white and perhaps not as conscious about some of these issues. And so that was an interesting paradox for them to find liberation in the teachings, but not to be fully seen for who they were in these places, and also not to see the teachers or the teachings reflect their experiences in this life. So I think that's why their commitment to this was so strong. I think around 2006, there just was a shifting of the board where there was a small core set of people who had complete alignment around the vision of urban Dharma commitment to diversity, gift economics, making sure that the center was a place that had no fees attached so that it was accessible to all. I think they also had a deep connection to this understanding that the Buddha thought of the teachings as priceless and that there are no barriers to accessing the Dharma in many of the countries of origin. But as Buddhism came to the West, that in the context of a highly individualistic and capitalistic society, it took on a whole different form here. And so that there are issues of accessibility, both in terms of location, but also in terms of price, with many meditation centers. That's why the core of generosity economics or gift economics was very important to them. So once they got to a place of alignment around 2006, there was a decision to change the name to East Bay Meditation Center to make it about Buddhist traditions and other wisdom traditions, with a core emphasis on Buddhism, but not being as tightly tied to just Vipassana, and the decision to be in Oakland. And I think because you had people with alignment around this vision, the other thing that I think was critical about that time is they started to hold community meetings to talk to the community around their vision, to ask them what they wanted that place to be like. So there was community involvement before the place was ever opened or formed.
And if I could just jump in there,
yes.
Brenda, this is Mushim. That practice, Ted, would be in alignment with as you probably know, the principles of cultural humility. There are some great YouTube videos on cultural humility by its founders. And part of their principles are that you go to the communities which you want to serve, and instead of telling them, here's what we're going to offer you, you ask them and say, what is it that you want? What is it that you need? We don't have infinite capacity, but we're going to write everything down and we're going to listen to everything you have to say. And your needs are going to be part of co-creating this spiritual organization that we are founding. So we're going to be a community from the very beginning. We're not going to build community. We're going to involve you to co-create community. There is no we and you. It's all of us in this together. So those two separate community meetings, I was at them that we rented a space in downtown Oakland and we advertised widely and people came and we served them pizza and salad and a light dinner. And we just said, we're here to listen to you.
How did that go? What sorts of things came up from that? I'm curious.
Number one, people wanted to have childcare, which we have not been able to provide because of liability and space reasons. And we know that the community wants and needs it. So we're keeping it on, some groups will call it the parking lot or the bike rack. In other words, it's not out of sight and it's not out of mind. It is something that we're very aware of. And we have been able to found a family program where young children can come into the space, which has caused us to baby-proof the space and take the initial steps to make this space family and child friendly. So we're moving in that direction slowly and surely. The other thing that I would say that the community wanted was for there to be safe, inclusive, and welcoming spaces for communities of people of color, separately for the LGBTQI community, whom we call, or they themselves want to be known as the Alphabet Sangha, because there are so many letters and many of them, they keep being more letters. So they're the Alphabet Sangha. And eventually there was a call for people who had chronic illness and pain or disability and who wanted a support group and a weekly meditation and discussion group that would meet their needs in a way that they felt they didn't need to explain themselves to anyone. They could find a common ground of a place where they could feel that basic understanding of some of their major issues. And that became another kind of sub-sangha or separate sitting group within East Bay Meditation Center. So already from the very beginning, we could see that in order to serve underrepresented communities, that we would need to be a kind of an umbrella or a mothership for quasi-autonomous meditation groups.
It seems diversity is a differentiator for East Bay. You're being more representative of the diversity of your local community. And there are many of us that see that as a strength and critical to the long-term health of the Sangha. What are your thoughts about why we may not be seeing quite so much active invitation for diversity in other centers?
Well, I'll come back to we're in the beginnings of a collaborative grant with several other organizations that are friends of ours, Spirit Rock Meditation Center, IMS in Massachusetts, and then New York Insight Meditation Center in New York. And so some of that conversation we've been having is about having an American Buddhism as diverse as American society. So what does it take to get there, and why is it important? So let me just share for folks in your community, when we were kind of talking about this collaboration to the Lens Foundation and to some of our colleagues across the Buddhist community last year, we asked them to close their eyes and to think back to a time when they went to a Buddhist retreat or a class and something in there clicked for them. They felt a sense of home there and realized they wanted to stay with the Buddhist teachings. And then obviously, as a lot of these folks are leaders or teachers ordained in various Buddhist traditions at this meeting, we said, okay, now who is that teacher where their sharing of the Dharma and their interpretation of the Dharma from their experience and their life connection resonated for you, and to picture that person in their mind. And then we had them open their eyes and we showed pictures of people of color who had been at a people of color retreat at IMS in Massachusetts, many of them there in long retreat for the first time. And so there were quotes from people there who said things like, it was the first time that I heard the Dharma from someone who looked like me and who interpreted the teachings through experiences that I could relate to and that had been through things similar to me, had experienced similar sufferings to me. And for the first time, I really found home in the Dharma. I had been in the Dharma before, but the first time I really, really found a deep home. Then I also have colleagues who teach the Dharma in Spanish, not here at EBMC, but other places, and had shared with me that one of the people who is going to her Spanish-speaking Dharma classes had said, this is the first time I've heard the Dharma in my mother tongue, and it hit me in such a deep core place. So I think that's one of the things when we talk about diversity, people think about just getting people's butts on the pillows. We'll open the door, we'll invite them, we'll make flyers, distributed them in parts of the community where people can see them that are people of color, etc. And so what I'll say to folks is that if your leadership, your teachers does not reflect the community, it's pretty likely that the folks will not feel welcome there.
Yeah, very good point. Mushim, what would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I wanted to add so much as to just underscore and perhaps repeat what Brenda said so that our listeners can hopefully understand how completely foundational and important it is. What we found in our East Bay Meditation Center Sangha, or spiritual community, Ted, is that our folks like to see faces. They like to see faces and bodies and hear personal stories of people with whom they identify within the different categories of groups which in the United States have, since we're in the U.S., I'll just speak about the U.S., different groups who have been targeted for oppression and historically for discrimination. So what that means is that actually two teachers could give identical Dharma talks. They could give identical Dharma talks, which are very wonderful, and say on the Four Noble Truths or something like that. It could be absolutely identical in terms of wording. And what our folks want to see, in addition to that, would be that the teacher or the person who is holding the teaching seat, who has that authority, who is representing that place of power actually in the room, is someone whom they feel looks like them, who looks like someone in their families, their ancestries, or who identifies as being in the LGBTQI community or of a certain generation, or someone whom they feel can understand their particular form of challenge, of dukkha, of suffering, if you will, so that then they won't need, in addition to suffering the injuries from those kinds of oppressions, that in addition, they feel they won't need to have to explain them or educate the person in the seat of power. And that has absolutely been key to everything we've been doing.
Along those lines, I just want to share when we were making that presentation, one of our colleagues from Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts, he spoke a lot about how are we going to remain relevant to future generations. And we are seeing that many centers, not just Buddhist, churches all over the country are becoming older and are failing to attract young people in general. And so this is a crisis that's, I think, happening in many communities like this. But he did mention that if you look at trees or diagrams of how Buddhism has spread across the world, that you'll see that there are branches that died off. And then there's also branches that flourished as they went to new countries. And a lot of that had to do with them adapting and meeting the needs of the communities and the countries that they went to and having some shifts in order to remain relevant and grow and thrive. And so Eric was very clear in his sharing of the presentation that we did together. If we don't make some of these adaptations to be diverse and to have shared leadership in this way, we will become irrelevant in this country. It's not new news to anybody that the demographics of this country are changing and that people of color are becoming the majority and are the majority in many places, and that we have many mixed race folks as well. So in order for us to remain relevant for future generations, the teachers, the leadership must reflect the diversity of the communities that they come from. From the indigenous perspective, we talk about the sacred hoop of humanity. So for me, diversity is not about getting folks in the pillow so we can save them or help them. It's actually that there's people missing from the hoop that have wisdom to give us. So when I think about the ways I've been taught about collective wisdom, you want to include people not because you have a one-way connection with them to give them something that will help their life. It's also that they're going to inform what you're creating and building, and they will change the very structure of what it is by what they bring to that table. So for us, it's really about, if you're not including all of humanity, if you're not exercising radical hospitality and radical inclusivity, the humanity in that place is incomplete. The wisdom in that place is incomplete.
Relationship and communication is not a one-way thing. It's at least two ways, if not a lot more.
And on that note, Ted, I would say for myself that is what has kept me so passionately involved with East Bay Meditation Center here in Oakland, California for so long, is my background is in the fine arts. And so I've always been part of artist communities. And that's kind of my basic personality grid, is that of the artist. So I regard East Bay Meditation Center as a continual kind of happening. Mm-hmm. This place is so full of creative people who, as we come together, as it has been with all traditional or throughout history, artist groups, artist communities, that there's this amazing synergy that forms, and people's creativity sparks other people's creativity, and when people want to give, they become excited about what they can be part of. And it's such a juicy and dynamic environment for spiritual practice and growth, as well as actually political practice and growth, because we're both social and spiritual and political. That one of our early key volunteers said, East Bay Meditation Center is not a meditation center. It's a movement. So that's what we do. We're moving. We're always in movement.
And it's interesting that you bring that up, because my experience prior to being here was I was doing a lot of movement building work in the social justice field, and doing a lot of, particularly interested, I was at Movement Strategy Center, where we talked a lot about transformational movement building, which was about this intersection between spirituality and social justice. And it's one of the reasons that EBMC intrigued me early on. And I do think that there's something very unique happening here. You know, I've been on boards of other spiritual communities that are really struggling right now to keep membership up, to stay open. And EBMC, you know, we opened our doors in 2007. We were a couple blocks away from here. We had one big room. We were almost immediately big waiting list, not enough room. And I was a volunteer registrar at that time. I wasn't a staff member. And we moved here to this new center in 2012, just 5 years later, because we were outgrowing that space. And we've never done intentional marketing, advertising, anything. It's all been word of mouth because of the level of community and ownership that people feel here. We had just a little under 8,000 individual visits in 2013, and we had over 14,000 individual visits in 2014. It's almost doubling, and I think that's because people feel such a strong sense of ownership here. There's only 5 part-time staff, and I don't know other places that can have the level of programming that we have and serve as many people as we do with so few staff. It's because we have over 150 volunteers that run this place. And they don't run this place because it's, oh, there's a place to volunteer and here's the description and I'll go do that thing. I think it's because they feel very co-creative in that volunteer space, that they feel like this is their home and they're manifesting it with us day by day.
Yeah, I think, Brenda, you really got the keen insight on that when you said that people feel empowered, that they're part of this. And that's what really builds that dynamic relationship, is that it's not simply as you were saying, oh, I sign up for this, I sign up for that, and I give time. It's like, no, you have the ability to actively shape what happens here. That's truly transformative. Mushim, I'm wondering if we can go back a little bit to something that you had mentioned about people of color groups, that seeing the same talk given by someone who looks like you makes a big difference. And I wanted to explore a little bit this idea that there is a position of power. And we've seen many communities struggle with issues arising from that. Have you found that just that association that we make as human beings to seeing someone speaking in a position of authority at the mountain seat who looks like us, does that help a bit in diffusing that difference, that gap between the person on the mountain seat and the person who's there to practice?
Absolutely. It helps to create that vital and living connection between, we could say, teacher and student. In these situations, if we want to call it that, it helps to create that living connection, which is one of caring, it's one of respect, and it is one that specifically we know here is a two-way street. It's not that the teachers are sitting on that mountain seat saying, hey, I'm going to lay my wisdom down on you, because we're just not like that. The teachers are expected to teach, and people do come here because they want to know more, and they want someone who presumably has some knowledge and experience in both meditation practice as well as in the classes that are Buddhism, in other wisdom traditions. We want people who have some expertise, of course, and we're completely built on the knowledge that we're always learning from one another. That as a spiritual community, we are a learning community. So we are in this together, and we are all essential parts of the whole. So part of East Bay Meditation Center's vision was that we would never be a teacher personality centered meditation center.
The cult of personality, yeah.
Exactly. We've really tried to go away from that. Of course, we have some teachers who have personalities and are very charismatic, who tend to draw lots and lots of people. Others, maybe not so much. And they're all valued. They're all valuable because we're not about upholding one or more teachers over others and saying these are our star teachers and everyone should come to hear such and such give a Dharma talk and be all wise and enlightened. We really want to respect that all of our teachers are kind of a collective. Some of them have more formal teaching experience than others. There's a lot of mentoring that goes on. There's a lot of sharing, and also the knowledge that none of us can cover all of the bases ourselves, that each of us holds a key part of the puzzle in bringing together the collective wisdom that East Bay Meditation Center is a container to hold.
And what a wonderful strength of that diversity in the teaching population, that you do have many more people in to give different perspectives, that in turn only fosters the ongoing growth of the community as a whole. So we've spoken a bit before this conversation about active versus passive invitations to those who may be struggling against bias. It may not be enough to build it and they will come, but you need to do more. So what are some of the more active things that people can do to not only foster the welcoming community, because certainly that needs to happen, but actively get people to deeply engage?
So I go back to what Mushim spoke about with the community meetings. To regularly have community meetings where you're asking people what they want and need instead of making the assumption that you know. Again, inviting teachers that are diverse to teach there so that people see themselves reflected there. The other thing that we do here that I think is important is that we have some programming that's open to everyone, and even that we set quotas around a minimum people of color at them. And then we have other programs that are actually very specific to supporting, we may have a day long for African American women or a day long for people who identify as LGBTQI. So we have both programmings that is inclusive of everyone in the community, and then programming that's specific to specific communities. And so people will go back and forth between those, and they're aware that the teachings will be related to their particular experience when they're going to some of those day longs. The other thing I will just say that I think has been such a great learning, and it's one of the inspirational stories of many last year, we noticed that for some of the day-longs that we had mixed groups, that was open to everyone, we noticed over the last couple years that the people of color registration was slowly starting to go lower and lower. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was a trend, and it was a concern for us, given that we're known for diversity at all of our things. So we invited a lot of the leadership and longtime Sangha members that were POC or people of color. We actually just called them together for lunch, got some food, and said, hey, this is going on. What do you guys think about this? We're noticing it's a trend. Do you think we should do something about it? Do you have any suggestions? And in that conversation, some people asked, is this a safe place to be honest about that question? I said, of course it is. And they said, some of the teachers here are really good at holding multicultural space. And so I feel safe in that space that it's less likely that sexism, racism, other isms will occur in that space. And if they do, I trust that the teacher will be skillful in using that as a teaching moment for the group. In other cases with teachers, we've noticed those things. They don't set up the container well. When it does happen, they don't understand the harm that was caused and don't take it seriously or don't understand it, actually. So, and I saw a lot of nodding of heads with other people in the room and said, yes, that's fine in my experience to do this. So they said, so some of us sign up for some teachers and not for others here at EDMC. And I said, that's helpful to hear. Can you tell me what some of the teachers who are skillful do that make that feel better for you, that are setting up the space better? And of course, they went to Mushim and they said, well, for example, Mushim always puts up these multicultural agreements about how we're going to communicate with each other in that space. And again, a lot of nodding of heads. And they said, that's one example. Other teachers do similar things. And then one person in the group said, hey, can we just have those agreements up for everything that we do here? And I said, that's a great idea. They said, we can do that. I was like, of course we can do that. And so now those things are printed up on the wall really huge. We have some work that we need to do around training all the teachers so they have that competency, because there's differing levels of that competency in our Sangha and our teacher Sangha. So I would say that there's just a level of both a diversity but also capacity to teach to multicultural audiences that is a skill that people need to have. And it goes back to that cultural humility piece. Like, are you able to hold a container that allows for different experiences, different wisdoms in the room, different ways of communicating, and really creating a space where people can really hear each other?
Yeah, it was interesting to hear you talk about how that there are different competencies. Some teachers, it's a simple fact, may be better at some things and the safe holding space than others. And it may be an innocent ignorance. And I'm encouraged by the way in which you're honoring that simple fact and helping those who need the help to get it and train up and be able to create that safe holding space in a better way.
And I'll just say that there's a deeper thing for me about the leadership, the board, the staff, the teacher Sangha. Like, there's a serious commitment. Because one of the things that has come clear to me in these conversations in the past year is that there's a core set of competencies you have to teach at EDMC. Dharmic competency is one of those things, but it's not the only thing. If you're not aware of racism, sexism, these things, having some kind of knowledge around those and facility to talk about and understand that those isms exist in our country and that there's historical and political reasons those things do exist and continue to exist. If you don't have that awareness and if you don't have the multicultural competency, then you actually can't teach here, because it's a commitment we have to being a multicultural space and a human space that allows all kinds of people, that makes that critical. So I'm clear that, many people may have dharmic training, but haven't been trained in this way. And so they may be able to teach many other places, but they're not going to work out well here because of how foundational and important the value of inclusivity is to us.
And also, I'd add to that, that's really excellent, Brenda, that we ask so much of our teachers because they need, in essence, I would say, to be good teachers for our communities here at EBMC, that the EBMC teacher needs to actually be trained as what we might even call a diversity and inclusion facilitator.
Yes.
They need to have those facilitation skills. So one example would be, our teaching is very interactive, Ted. So it's not just talking heads. I lecture, you listen, you ask questions. I sit on the seat of power and I answer because I'm so enlightened. Everybody dedicates some merit. And
I imagine there are about 5,000 listeners right now who are like, yeah, I've been there.
And there can be very excellent talks in my training. I sat and I listened and I absorbed so much wisdom and it was just wonderful. However, in terms of feeling included or co-creating, no, I felt I was a receiver. I didn't feel I was co-creating anything. And so the wisdom was only flowing in one direction. And so most of us as teachers here include very interactive exercises. We have community building. We urge people in a safe and appropriate and respectful way to greet one another and sometimes exchange a little bit about what brought them to the center so that we start to really engage them in a personal way. And we have small group and large group work. So a good example, I think, of what we're talking about is that whenever I have, say, a one-day retreat or a class series that goes on, say, for 4 weeks on a weekly basis, whenever we have full group discussion or Q&A, I will remind the group that one of our multicultural agreements is to move forward and move back. This is sometimes languaged as step forward, step back. And what this means is if you're a person who talks very easily, you have lots of ideas, you're full of enthusiasm and questions, and you've already spoken once in full group, that the next time there is an opportunity to share, we ask you to remain silent. You might have 100 wonderful questions that in fact would be good things for other people to hear. We ask you to really refrain from speaking, and that is a discipline, so that other people who are shyer, who are quieter, who are maybe afraid of speaking in a large group, or, and this is important, who because of their cultural and ethnic background, that the way that their culture operates is it's not polite to speak up until you've been invited personally to speak, or you may be trained to defer to elders or to people who appear to be more experienced, which means we might never hear from those people who have wonderful wisdom and whose voices we particularly want to hear because they're quiet everywhere else. So just by being a teacher and holding that space and being really pretty strict about it, just looking people right in the face and saying, if you've spoken up before, I'm sure you have wonderful things to say, and I'm going to ask you to be quiet and open up a space, even if there's uncomfortable silence, that's fine. We're going to wait for those who are quieter for any reason to be the ones invited to speak first. That in itself produces a structural change in the way that a Dharma group operates, that you can tangibly feel it in the room.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's a totally different energy from that dynamic, from that space, from that safe space that is created in active engagement, in opening. And I'm wondering if you've also found that listening is something that people might not be so good at doing naturally, and we may find ourselves needing to help people learn how to just listen.
That's one of the agreements too, is to practice deep listening and to be really present when you're listening and not rehearsing in your head what you're going to say when they're done.
And we also practice active listening. I always train folks in active listening, which in my understanding means that you develop the capacity to listen to someone whose experience may be so totally different from your own that you either almost violently disagree with them, A, or B, you really have no idea what they're talking about. And you just listen with your whole heart with the intention of trying to understand as they want to be understood. Not as you analyze them, but as they want to be understood. And then when they finish speaking, you're invited to repeat back maybe 2 or 3 of the main points that you understood that they wanted to communicate. And then you check in with them. This is what I heard you say. Did I hear you correctly? Did I understand you? And the other person may say yes, but then again, they may say, no, that isn't exactly what I meant. Let me explain it again. And we continue with this process until we've been able, through active listening, to bridge some of the cultural and personal gaps or differences between people in ways that can be exciting and enriching.
You'd also mentioned some best practices. I'm wondering if there's anything from that you'd care to share.
I think one thing that might be useful for your community, which is, again, part of these agreements, is to understand the difference between intention and impact. I think that is one that comes up in multicultural communities quite frequently, and also just between people, even if people are similar. Just really understanding, acknowledging impact of your words and your actions when people share them with you, because it takes a lot of courage for people to share when you've had harmful impact on them. And then also that denying the impact of something said by focusing on your intention and defending what you did is actually often more destructive than the initial interaction that they had with you. So when someone's coming to you with a sense of injury or concern or harm, that, again, practicing the active and deep listening and letting their experience be their experience. I think that's one of the things I think that has been an important practice here at EBMC, and we're still working on it. We're all still working on it.
It's very subtle, this subtle aggression of intention.
And it also can just be innocent. Yes. I mean, our intent is often we're genuinely good-hearted people and we want to learn, and we're excited by being in a room with people whom we perceive as different from ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so we want to know more, and we may not understand that by leaning on the wheelchair of the person in front of us and touching it, that it's just like touching part of their body, that we need to learn to respect it. Don't touch the wheelchair unless you're invited to do so for some reason. So learning about one another often comes from a very, very good-hearted place, mm-hmm. and it can result in very negative impact because it can replicate harms and injuries that are very severe for people in underrepresented communities. The other thing I wanted to mention and add to this is because I think, as Brenda has mentioned, when we bring in the concepts of intent versus impact, we're reflecting language and practices from the field of diversity and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to invite the people who are hearing this podcast to take a look at a couple of things. And one, and especially those of you who are building Sanghas, I want those Sanghas to be actively diverse, not passively diverse in the sense of saying we welcome everyone. That's a passive invitation. But how do we actively both recruit and retain diversity? So again, I am a diversity and inclusion consultant, and I'm using that terminology because it does apply. We can recruit people who come from diverse backgrounds, but do we have any plan of how we're going to retain them? As Brenda said, once we get them into the chairs and the sitting meditations, mats and cushions, that's not enough. So we have a room that has exciting diversity in it. How do we actually retain that diversity? How do we nurture that diversity? How do we make sure that we know that people feel welcomed and fully included? So these two resources are one. I'd invite people to Google Loden's Wheel. That's from a diversity consultant named Marilyn Loden, and it's a standard tool in the diversity and inclusion field. Loden, Loden's Wheel, showing that concept of dimensions of diversity so that communities and spiritual communities that are forming, wherever you are, you can adapt that tool to your own use and say, well, does my community include people who are representative of these dimensions of diversity, such as age, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, ability, and so on, as well as dimensions we might not normally think of, such as work style and military background. So that's just a really good basic tool. Then the second thing I invite people to look at is that I've been named this year as an expert panelist for an open source tool called the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks, the GDIB, Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmarks. And that can be found, you can Google it, or it's I think, at diversitycollegium.org. And it's a free tool that all organizations can use that is a global tool with diversity and inclusion benchmarks that can be really helpful in helping us to understand all the areas in which a truly diverse and inclusive organization is extremely active. And I mean extremely. For us to meet these benchmarks in an increasing fashion means we're so active that we're going to be almost in a hyperdrive of learning that is incredibly rewarding for people who engage in it.
And for those who are listening to the podcast, I will link both of those on the episode page for this episode. So if you come on over, we'll have those links for you. Thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to ask what some of the challenges are that you've faced with creating and supporting the diverse community at the center, because it's not a sprint. It's a marathon, and it's that sustainment piece that really contributes to the long-term health of the community.
Well, I would say definitely in the ways we've been talking about the multicultural agreements, that when you bring people together across difference, people have very different understandings, very different sufferings, and so it's not uncommon to have people harm one another or say things that are unskillful in this community because they come from such diverse backgrounds. So I think that's where creating the muscle of the multicultural capacity is really important. So that has been some of the challenge. And I think sometimes when harm happens, one of the things that we're working on right now is there's a bunch of Sangha members across the Sangha being trained up in restorative justice and peacemaking circle work, as we mentioned. And so like building that muscle to be able to address harm in a good way, to see it as a restoration of relationship, and to move away from retributive kind of ways of dealing with conflict and harm and seeing them as opportunities for individual and collective growth and healing. I think the other challenge for us has been, and also a gift as well, is that we're very committed to generosity economics. That's very intentional. This isn't about providing scholarships for low-income people so they come and work, or there's limited slots for folks. Everything here is on a gift economics basis, so that there's no limit to, who can come. So we serve a lot of low-income folks here, and some folks who are homeless and or jobless at the moment that they're going through. Many folks come to spiritual community when they're times of crisis, which is not surprising. So I would say because we're a gift economics basis, we have times in our history just been really struggling with sustainability financially. And that commitment to us is around creating a world that works for everyone, where no one's excluded. I think we're getting better and better at that because one of our core commitments is about transparent democratic governance. And the more we talk to our Sangha about what our needs are, what it takes to run this place, people show up and step up in ways that always surprise and delight us. Again, because it's something they're co-creating. We're not asking you give money to us. It's like, keep our collective moving together,
It's like you give money to you.
Pretty much, yeah. There's folks who are very low income who have shared with me that they, as soon as they get a paycheck, a chunk of that comes here. Like it's a statistical fact that low income folks are much more generous with donations in this country than wealthy people are as a percentage of their income and overall as well, in terms of giving in this country. And so I see how much people give here because they often say to me, I wish I could give more because I'm getting so much. This place has saved my life. I've heard that phrase so many times in the last year, that EBMC has saved my life. So they the level of investment, not just from people who are in this community, but from people outside the community, people who have left and moved away and still contribute, or people from other places that say, I'm so inspired by your model as a model of a world that works for everyone, that excludes no one, that is operating on gift economics where everyone is cared for. It's such an inspiring model to me that I'm giving to you because I think that you're a microcosm for what's possible in the world. So there's people who donate that don't even attend here. And then there's people outside of here who are trying to create their own EBMC-like experiments in other places. They're hungry for information about our model, and our capacity is so low. But I'm clear that what we're doing here is about more than just EBMC. It's about creating a world that works for everyone and doesn't leave anyone behind.
And Mushim, how about you? Some challenges, or I think we also may be segueing into favorite inspirational stories for the center.
We are, and before we do that, Ted, I'll say that from my point of view, with my history with EBMC, is that the two biggest challenges we faced are exactly what Brenda named: educating ourselves and getting better at making known what the principles of gift economics are and how gift economics works. So within the some segments of the American Vipassana meditation communities, it's called the Dana talk, where at some point, usually at the end, but not always, at some point in a teaching, a workshop, a one-day retreat, a 7-day retreat, whatever, some Buddhist or Dharma-based event, that someone in a position of leadership asks people to donate as generously as they can and to give dana, which is the practice of generous giving in the southern Buddhist countries, that the word would be there. Of course, there's generous giving in all spiritual groups and in all Buddhist groups. But they would ask for dana or monetary contributions to be given for the organization, and either together with that or separately for the teacher or teachers. And what we've discovered here at East Bay Meditation Center is that our community is a generous community. They are a warm, loving, generous group. Some of them have money to give. Some have time and volunteer time and skills to give. Others give with a smile. Others give with their deep listening and their respectful presence. So we do have a very generous community. And in order to become sustainable, then that's actually a separate matter. For that, we need to be able to educate the community as to what our needs are and what it actually takes in terms of dollars and cents to keep this place running without burning out the leadership and the part-time staff. And so that's where the worldwide gift economics movement is. We're taking our place within that movement. We're learning with that movement. We're contributing to that movement. The second out of two leading challenges is for East Bay Meditation Center is one that I would never have predicted before I became part of it. And that is that we do strive to be as accessible to as many people as possible. And that includes folks like myself who have multiple chemical sensitivities, asthma, and other environmental illnesses, which makes this group of people very, very sensitive and reactive to fragranced personal products and clothing products. And these could be synthetic or they could be natural aromatherapy products and botanical-based scents. And so we do have a fragrance-free policy here, and that I would say has been the single most contentious issue within this community, because what happens, Ted, is that when you ask people to have used fragrance-free shampoo, skin products, to have washed their clothing in fragrance-free detergent and not to dry them with products like Bounce, which are fabric softeners, highly scented, that we cross over the line from asking people to have a certain covenant or agreement of how they're going to act when they're here in the meditation center, being quiet, being attentive, following along with the meditations, that kind of thing. Those are normal social norms. And we cross over that line into having an impact on the personal products. that people use on their bodies, the scented candles they want to burn in their home, which are beautiful and soothing to them, all kinds of things, of the cleaning products they're using in their homes, which are going into the textiles and the clothing that they wear. So that is a very sensitive area that for a country as individualistic as people in the United States are, for our culture is going over into people's ability to personally choose products that they find to be helpful, products that they find to be healthy, products that they find to help them feel more attractive and beautiful. And it's a sacrifice that needs to be made for people to prepare themselves physically, actually, as well as spiritually and emotionally, to come and be in the meditation center in harmony with people who are ill. So that's a work that's always in progress, and it's been involved a lot of learning for us, as well as the cultural implications that some folks come from cultures in which the use of scented products is part of their spiritual practices and really is so meaningful to them in terms of representing their ancestry and their beloved ancestors who have not been represented in mainstream history, that being able as a community to talk to one another compassionately, openly, sometimes carefully, and to arrive at a mutual understanding of how we want to support one another's well-being is still a work in progress.
How about some of the inspirational stories, Mushim, that you've run into over the years?
As Brenda said, there have been so many, and the theme and variation on that theme of the ones I hear the most are exactly what she named. This place, meaning East Bay Meditation Center, has saved my life. And this is not meant metaphorically. When an organization such as ours has been founded to serve underrepresented communities, what we mean by that is these are communities who are struggling every day under structural oppression. So that means homophobia, transphobia, racism, ableism, socioeconomic class privilege, white privilege. These are all aspects of power dynamics, power and privilege dynamics in the United States, which create unearned privilege for some groups of people and lack of access to much needed basic services and survival for other targeted populations. So when we say that we provide a place that people have said, this place saved my life, they do not mean it symbolically. They mean that they've been able to come here, they've been able to learn practices of mindfulness, of self-love, of dignity, of being able to feel that they're being upheld and they're learning how to uphold themselves, their families, their communities. They're coming to a place that recognizes their ancestors and their descendants as being beautiful, powerful, worthy, empowered people in our society. And that all of that has an incredible impact on people's physical health, their mental health, and their ability to feel resilient and to be able to do their jobs and take care of themselves and their families. Literally, their lives depend on the kind of services that we strive to provide.
What else would each of you like to share with the listeners?
I think I just want to share one more story, and that is that because so many of our communities identify as people of color, in the context of all the things that started happening in Ferguson and New York last year, many of these communities have actually been organizing or writing or working on issues of police brutality or violence, in particular in communities of color, for many years. And there was an opening that started to happen where people beyond those communities started to see for the first time the injustice and brutality that these folks have been experiencing, their ancestors have experienced since the founding of this country. Like, that isn't just an individual isolated incident of a police officer. It's a cultural shift that we have to make about how we see dignity and value in all lives. And that's why I think Black Lives Matter became such a catchphrase for many of those folks in that movement. I will say, because we had so many people in our community that identify as people of color, seeing these events unfold across the country brought up a lot of trauma of their own as well as ancestral trauma. And so one of the things that our community decided to do was open our doors during off hours to say, if you need a place to come and sit, if you need a place to come and cry, if you need, we know that this is causing a lot of pain for all of you. So if you need that, please come. And people of all races, white allies who felt pain at what their brothers and sisters were suffering, as well as people of color, dropped in throughout the week to meditate, to sit together, to do what they needed to do. We offered some healing practices for those who felt they wanted that or needed that in that moment. And then we also held a ceremony called Beyond Ferguson, which is about honoring and healing all the ancestors of this country. It's a beautiful ceremony written by Larry Ward for a people of color retreat that I attended at Deer Park Monastery. But it's this lovely ceremony where you read a section of each of the ceremony for the different races of humanity that exist in the United States, acknowledging the pains and oppressions, the contributions and gifts, and the important people of those different lineages that have gone either acknowledged or unacknowledged in our country's history, and then to release the suffering of those people. And it was important to do that for our multicultural Sangha that has members of all those different racial lineages within our walls, and the way they were feeling a lot of suffering and pain around what was happening in the country at that time. And I remember we put up that event, and in about a week and a half, it was full. And people were clamoring to get in. They said, we need this so much right now, individually and collectively. And it's something we want to offer every year, but there is just a tremendous amount of healing we have to do as a country. And that's one of the things for me, I think, about creating the kind of story that we've had some stories in this country that have harmed parts of our community. And how can we create a new story that brings all of us forward together? And what does it mean to make space for that story to include everyone?
Thank you, Brenda. How about you, Mushim?
Well, I do have something to add, which is that here at East Bay Meditation Center, we aren't shy about using the words oppression, power, privilege, words that are sometimes not found at all in Dharma talks given at other Buddhist groups in the United States and beyond. And our teachers are competent and are skillful in bringing forth their own stories and using teaching stories from many different cultures and many different voices that can skillfully introduce Dharmic concepts and the teachings of liberation and freedom to the folks who come here. And so there just has been so much positive transformation in healing that's occurred in, I guess, the 8 or so years that we've had our doors open. And this positive transformation, Ted, has, I would say, led to a lot of joy. Mm. We have a very serious spiritual community in the sense of that we address serious issues in spiritual growth and in the power dynamics and political situation in the United States. And we also have such a joyful and deeply happy community in so many ways. And our teachers, myself included, emphasize joy. I have often taken a page from the book of Thich Nhat Hanh, who certainly knows whereof he speaks, having been through what he's been through in Vietnam, in the West, after he was exiled. And when he says suffering is not enough, that certainly there is suffering, and it's not enough. That life is also full of wonderful things and refreshing things and joyful elements. Mm-hmm. And as we incline the mind to be able to recognize those elements and to be able to laugh. I actually teach a lot through being silly. I encourage people to have fun, to be silly in a respectful way that's respectful to other cultures, and to just free themselves from the actually unneeded constraints that a lot of adults have. We've just been conditioned to sort of hold it in a certain way, and we don't actually need to do so. We can be playful. We can loosen up. And we can express ourselves creatively in ways that promote more joy. And the more joy we bring, joy is a kind of energy. And traditionally, as you know, in Buddhist theory and in teachings, joy is a positive energy that can lead towards spiritual awakening and freedom and liberation, because the mind becomes more open when people are joyful, when they laugh, when they play, and then they become open and creative and more receptive to new learning.
Yeah, we see so much seriousness in our approach to contemplative practice, and maybe not quite as much playful curiosity as we could also invite.
Absolutely. And an instance would be that I taught a half-day retreat for committed practitioners here. We're trying to have them once a month, so we do have rotating teachers, and I have taught quite a few of them. And so I've taken on the traditional format of the 5 hindrances. And these are supposed to be things that hinder our spiritual growth. And so I'm just knocking off the traditional list one by one. And so the first one was sensual desire. And I brought in potato chips and yummy chocolate truffles and some seaweed snacks just to mix it up from Trader Joe's. And they put them out on a table here in the library where we're sitting. And I said to the folks, all right, we're going to actually investigate sensual desire, because talking about it intellectually is not going to cut it. So I'm telling you, I have these yummy things laid out in there, and you can go in there and take one thing, but there are not enough chocolates for all. There aren't enough for everyone. And then we're going to come back and we're going to mindfully eat our treat. And then we're going to have a discussion about what you noticed arising in your body and mind. And people came up with hilarious and very deeply truthful things about how it actually came into their mind. How could I cut to the front of the line so I can get exactly what I want? Or how could I sneak in from the back door of the buffet room? And it was funny and it was playful on one hand. And it was also deeply serious in actually revealing what those thoughts of craving and desire are that actually amount to greed and excluding other people.
Wonderful practice. Well, for those listening, if you'd like to find out more, you can go to the website www.eastbaymeditation.org. I'll be linking that on the episode page for this episode. And Mushim's WordPress is mushim.wordpress.com. I'll also be linking that. Our guest today, Mushim Ikeda. Mushim, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much.
And Brenda Salgado. Brenda, thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.